So the way that this is going to work is that podcast marketing means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and there's a lot of different levels of where it is. So we can talk and I can jump into things and you can ask questions, but I want everybody to be respectful of like where you might be at, where your podcast might not be where somebody else is at, but there's still a good like way to share information. I believe in like co-learning, so I think everybody here has something to share that might inform something else that we could do better. So that's kind of the pedagogy that I'd love to practice in lecturing today. I'm also going to the way that I'm going to walk through this is I'm going to talk to you about the concept. It's going to start out big and get really small. So we're going to talk about how you would approach things, how you would do a campaign. Then we're going to talk about what goes into a campaign, what is strategy, and then like the actual things that you would put down into the campaign. So we can think about it as a funnel. And then I will be around to talk and like jump into things and figure all that kind of stuff out. The first premise that I start with when I talk about marketing is this idea. And this is the way I start every idea of marketing. I have been doing general marketing for about 18 years. I started in the music business industry at major record labels in New York, started my own record label, did a festival, and then went to be a professor in marketing, and now I do full-time podcast marketing here at PRX. I'm a head of a team that launches about 120 different marketing campaigns for podcasts a year. So I've seen it all. I've seen the back-end data. There's lots of things I still don't know and trying to learn. But this is the basic premise that I push forward that keeps me going, is that I am never just publishing. I'm never just pushing like play or uploading something. I'm always creating a launch. And usually you only get one launch moment, but sometimes when you are in a rut or you think your podcast is maybe plateauing or things like that, me and my team try to figure out how can we create another launch moment? How can we get like attention to bring people back again? And so this like basic premise is that even if you think of every social media post, every episode, every new season as launching versus publishing, what does that mean to you? What do you think about when you hear the difference between the two? What's a quick reference that somebody has?
Launch and liftoff.
Yes, liftoff, yeah. What was it over here?
Oh, active versus proactive.
Yeah, exactly. This is a tough thing to swallow, but podcasting is so prolific and everybody is doing it that if you are making content and you're putting it out there, you are a marketer. You have to be. You have to be thinking about audience. So you are in the launching business. The days of like you get to be this artist and you get to like just make the thing in a room and put it out there are kind of gone. And in some ways that's beautiful, in some ways that kind of sucks. But if you are making a podcast, you have to be starting to think about how am I going to launch? Even if I'm just a host, how am I going to collaborate and get people to pay attention to it? Because there's just too many podcasts out there. There's about 5 million actively published and only 89% of them make it past the 3rd episode. And so there's just a lot of bloat out there and there's a lot of attention for your eyes or your ears. Okay, this is another thing that I put here, and this might be a high-level thing that doesn't make any sense to you, or this might sit right and square and like, oh, I get what he's saying here. There was a time where if you were to attend any type of podcast marketing event, go to like a lecture or things like that, they would be like, get on other people's podcasts. That is how you're going to get the most bang for your buck. Sometimes these things are called cross promos. I can explain what those are, but everybody understands the idea of like, I have a podcast, somebody else has a podcast. If my podcast or my voice or a promo of mine appears on their podcast, I might get some of their audience. I want to just lead with that is one small piece of marketing. It is not the end of actual marketing. And in fact, it's like relatively just okay in its effectiveness. When we do large cross-promo campaigns, we shoot for about a 2% conversion rate, which isn't great, but in industry terms, it's actually pretty good for what we would want. So I just want to lead with like, we have more. And the more that we have is that we're going to create this idea of a campaign, okay? And what I think that we should also start about is like, we have this idea of like, I just told you you're a marketer if you're making podcasts. And how can we not make that feel bad? Or not like me not enjoy that? Because that is the key here, is that if anything that I say here today sounds like I can't do that or I don't want to do that, then I think kind of let it go, because the point is like you need to be making your podcast and publishing it. You need to be putting it out there, you need to be learning, you need to be prototyping. And so if this stuff seems like additive or in the way, that's okay. Most people's first podcast is not their most successful podcast. It normally takes iterations. You should get in the mindset of prototyping. But if you're making podcasts, we should start with, how do I stop hating marketing and start to embrace it? And the two things that I really take on for my team and for me is that all marketing efforts should be on a timeline, okay? So if you have a podcast and you're just like, we're just gonna be doing tweets ad infinitum forever or whatever, or I'm going to try to figure out Instagram, or I'm just going to like market things even when I'm not in season, you will burn out, because you don't know what goal you're attaching it to, and you don't know how long you're doing it. You don't give yourself a window to like dip out. You're just doing this endless effort and you don't even know why, and you start to feel burnout before you even have the words for burnout, right? The second thing is that, so we have this idea of it should be on a timeline. Another way to say that is that's a campaign. So what am I doing? How am I measuring it? All that kind of stuff. And every campaign should establish clear communication early with the entire team. Okay? So that means anybody that is making the podcast should understand what is the efforts of the marketing that we're actually going to be doing, right? There was a time, and there has been this pervasive idea of like newsrooms or hosts or special people make podcasts and they just give it over to marketing. And like they do their thing, right? They do their magic. That doesn't exist anymore, okay? It has to be in collaboration. And so when you go into campaign, if you work with a host, you work with a producer, you should have shared goals. We're trying to raise our downloads by 10% this year. We're going to increase our social media. We're actually going to have an event. We might have a sponsor. We're going to try to get ads. We're going to increase impressions. And how are we going to know when we're successful, and how are we going to know when we're not, and what are we testing? That is the basic premise of marketing. And all of these are based on campaigns. So when you have a good marketing understanding, you should start off with this document that is just, what are our goals? What are our measurable outcomes? Normally they have data points. What are these identifiable data points? Get into your back end, actually look at some of those numbers, understand what they might mean to you, and then agree upon how are we going to share that out. You would be surprised how many podcasts I work with that never go into their back-end data, never look at it, and I truly believe if you are not looking at numbers and measuring them, you will not grow. It doesn't just magically happen. You have to be emotionally attached to growth. It's not like so I started off in the music business industry. I got hired at Atlantic Records to do everything video that was not a music video, okay? So like anything that was YouTube or stuff like that. And what they wanted me to do is create virality. Do you guys remember this music video by OK Go, where it was like they would be on treadmills and things like that? That is why I got hired. They were like, create that moment. And within 3 weeks, I was like, I can't do it. Like, you can't create viral marketing. That's not a thing, right? Creating and chasing viral ideas is not a campaign and not a strategy. You shouldn't do it, right? You need to do the slow, boring, unsexy thing of having goals and data and measuring things and doing it over a period of time. So this right here, an example of unsexiness, is marketing, okay? This is a strategy. And this is a very basic strategy, but it has a point, it has a brand, and it works. So this is Stuff You Should Know podcast. And they thought about, how do we do our Instagram? How is it going to look? Well, they do these things called show cards. So they have show cards over there where they just they say the episode, and they just tell you what it is, and they have a little bit of description on there. When I took this snapshot a long time ago, there was 500 likes and 16 comments on it. That's okay engagement for just an episode card. Everything else that they do that's not an episode card goes into their stories, and they catalog it accordingly, right? That is a strategy. And I say this to say that you likely think strategically, you just don't give it the words necessarily to think about strategy. But this, if you're a native social media user, you already understand strategically how to communicate, which is the basics of marketing. So there's two things I'm going to tell you about marketing. The first is the most important. It is not rocket science. Anybody can do it. I am not a smart person, and I am doing it. You are likely much smarter than me and can do it really well. It is a soft skills job. It is just breaking it down into pieces and figuring out what you're going to do, how you're going to prototype it, and how you're going to measure it. And I just want to empower you, especially as early creators or somebody with an idea of creation, that marketing is within your grasp. You don't have to do everything that I'm going to talk about today. You can do some of it, and you can do a lot of it well. The thing that you know more than I know is who your user is and who your people are and who your potential audience are. And when you start to ask questions about them, what do they do? How do they engage? Where are they? You become an expert and you start thinking about how do I get in front of those places. That is the basic ethos of marketing, and that's why it's not rocket science. The other thing is that when we define it, it is just strategically using communication tools to grow audience. It's important to understand and give marketing a little bit of language, because in my job, some people, and I love this, will come to me and say, we're not getting sales anymore. We're not getting nobody's buying our podcast. Great, because that's not my job. Marketing has nothing to do with your sales, and I get to check out of that conversation, right? And so by really creating what it is that I do, that I'm using communication tools to grow audience, I can really provide a better service because I'm being very specific about what it is I'm doing for your podcast, right? Okay. Every problem that I go in to diagnose for growth, or if I'm just coming along a podcast for the first time on how to grow it, I start in one of two different places. The first place that they normally want me to start is the external portion, is that now I'm going to strategically communicate for your product. This exists under the premise that you have a product that people want and that people are going to download and listen to. And even if you don't, I can do certain things to get people to listen to it or be aware of it, right? But only to a certain degree. And I really want to place importance on this idea that outwardly is external marketing and internally is also internal marketing. And the idea that is your product actually designed for the audience that you want to consume it? Are you meeting a basic need? More than we used to just say, design the podcast that you wish existed, right? I think we're post to that, and that design the podcast that you think doesn't exist for the people that you think don't have it. And so the idea is that you need to rethink about if people aren't listening to my podcast, do they actually want to hear local musicians? And maybe they do, but how do they want to hear it, or why, or what do they want to hear about that, right? The internal question of your podcast is equally as important of how are you getting it out to other people. Anybody agree or disagree, or thoughts on that? Yeah? Okay. Seems right. You can disagree with me. That's important if that happens. This slide right here is this could be my entire deck. This is the most important slide. This is usually what I spend the most time on. It's what I've written a couple articles about. This is an inventory of what are the levers that you have to pull as a marketer. So what this idea is that you as a marketer, because you are part of a podcast, you have a list of things that you can do, strategic communication tools, to grow your audience. And what a basic campaign should start out with is list everything that you feel like you could do, okay? So this is close to an exhaustive list of all the items that you might be able to do, but you can start with your own list of what could you do. Then you go back and you evaluate and you say, what can I do? And then most importantly, what do I like doing? Where am I already natively doing this? What would give me energy? What would combine with some other effort that I'm doing? Do those things and forget about the rest. That is the most important thing for you to do with marketing. Now, if you grow and you're making a lot of money or you have a dedicated marketing team, then you get to open up and you get to talk about these other things that might grow your podcast. But if it's just you, or if it's just you and your friend, or if it's just starting out, you need to start in a place where it's the thing I'm going to dedicate to grow my audience is fill in the blank. Maybe it's a newsletter, maybe it's a social media account, maybe it's events, maybe it's being in a community, but that is really where your focus needs to go. Because if you go to a place where you're not native to it, or you're not interested in it, it's going to just feel like fluff, and again, we're going to approach that burnout, right? I'll go through all of these just quickly to kind of show you what my math would be on growth for a podcast, okay? Number one up there, it is not a great background, but it says website. Most podcasts need a website for the simple reason of search engine optimization. So this idea of if I am Googling what you do, I would love it to come up somewhere in the search engine of now we're around that area. Also, if I listen to a podcast, I don't know about you, but sometimes I want to be a fan of it. I want to find out more information about it. I might want to contact them. This is the digital business card, the website, okay? It has not gone away. If you are a podcast and you don't have a website, you should have a plan to eventually have a website. Every podcast eventually needs a website. It is a luxury for some podcasts, though. So you can exist on Facebook or Instagram knowing that you'll eventually build a website, but that's one that eventually you really need a place where people can find your podcast outside of just a social media account. Tracking? Cool? Okay. Then there's events. You can market your podcast through owned events, events that you're putting on, or associated events. I'll be really clear. If you start a podcast and you're not getting like about 10,000 downloads per episode and you're not connected to a public radio station, events are going to be hard. So associating yourself with somebody else, combining, maybe getting in with another like cultural hub or something like that, that's a really cool way to elevate your podcast. I had a podcast that I was producing for comic books, and I connected it with the local Comic Con. And so they would host like about 30% of all of the panels, and they were the presenting sponsor, so they would always like get their podcast out there. Wasn't their event. Nobody would have come to just their podcast event, but them being a host for other things was a good way to think about associated event growth, right? Okay. Social media. These are all the accounts that are there. I'm going to go through them later. This is about the accounts that you need to really consider. You could throw in Blue Sky, you could throw in Threads. Early adoption is always good and interesting. If you're active and you're going to be there, go ahead and dive into that. PR, press, this is the hardest one. This is the like most luxury of like all marketing. And it's this idea of can I get somebody to cover my podcast, or can I pitch a platform to feature me? Does everybody know what that means when I say that? Pitch a platform to feature me, right? So this is the idea. Who uses Apple as their platform to listen to podcasts? Great. Who uses Spotify? Yep. Who uses something else? What do you use?
I can't remember the name of it right now. It wasn't Deezer.
Oh, we did. There's Deezer. There's Deezer, Pocket Casts. Yeah, Pocket Casts. Listen FM. All of these have a little bit of like, let's call it like a bookshelf or a browsing section that like is telling you about new podcasts or check this out or something like that, where you can browse. You can also use your NPR app to listen to podcasts, and you should. And there's lots of features in there. You can pitch to those things. All of those have Googleable places where you can find how to submit your podcast and tell them about your podcast. It is a little bit of a cold call, but anybody is open to submit their podcast to get featured in those areas. So that's different. That's featured on platforms. And then there's press. Advertising can be paid, or you can earn it. You can trade. You can, for things to get the advertising, whether it's in your newsletter or your events or things like that, it's a good way early on, if you aren't getting paid for your podcast, to trade other people for some visibility in your podcast so that you can have visibility on whatever it is that they have, right? Other podcasts, this is my first slide. So cross promos is just giving somebody else a promo, and they give you a promo, and you play it for the same amount of downloads. It's a great way. Anybody can do it, especially if you do a local podcast. Like, I can't really emphasize that enough, but if you have a local podcast and somebody else has a local podcast, the likelihood that somebody listens to both of those podcasts is actually not very high from what we've found. But you're getting somebody in your community, even if they just get like 500 listens, like within a month, those 500 loyal people that would probably feel like it's a benefit to hear about another local podcast in their area. So you can directly email them or whatever it is to trade that type of promotion. There's also swaps. That means you actually put your podcast in their feed, or you do they're in your feed. And then you can pitch yourself for guest appearances. Maybe you're an expert on something. Maybe you want to like talk about something or whatever, so you can pitch your show to what you're doing there. Podcasts build emails all the time. Substack, you become an expert in something. This is a great way to do that. And then if you have a owned broadcast, meaning if you are already a organization, a media organization, anything that exists, do not sleep on using that to broadcast your podcast. That is like one of the number one things you can do. I'm going to tell you an uncomfortable truth. If you are a podcaster, you are an influencer, and you own an influence of something, right? You are the expert on something, and you can tell people about that thing. And you can publish about things that you aren't even making episodes on. That's why you use emails, that's why you use social media, all of that kind of stuff. If people come to your source, whether that's social media or email, just because they understand that you represent the influence of whatever it is you make, you are going to get lots and lots of audience, rather than just saying, the only thing that I really do is make this one podcast, right? But thinking of yourself as an influencer, like the expert of something, is a great way to start for a marketing plan, okay? That's a long list. This is a long slide. It's not meant to like really force you to do everything. And I really want to emphasize that. Like if you see this list and you're like, I can't do Twitter and I'm not going to do email, great, you understood the assignment. That is the point of this slide, is to not have you do everything, but to consider the possibilities of what could you do. Cool? Good to move on?
Yep.
All right, sweet. Okay, so that's the campaign. So now we're going down that funnel. So I've told you the idea about a campaign, but how do you design that campaign? Anybody here a social media manager? Or do social media management work? Okay, social media manager, and this might be like news to somebody that doesn't do it, they are never posting directly. Does that make sense? So like a good social media manager is never just pulling up the account and typing in something and pushing play and publish, right? Every social media manager knows they schedule their posts. They schedule it over a period of time. They think about what they're going to do, even if they're scheduling like an hour in advance, or if they're scheduling like a day in advance or something like that. The reason why is that every campaign has a timeline that's associated with the assets that you're producing. So when you publish an episode, just like I showed you stuff you should know, you want to be thinking about what are the pieces of content that I'm going to also publish on social media. Can I schedule those? Maybe I don't actually, this is Hootsuite, I think. Maybe you don't actually use a back-end way to publish. Maybe you just have a calendar that just says on this type of day, on this day I might make this type of content post or whatever. Just basically this idea of like every time you make a podcast, what other content are you making that goes around with it that tells people it, right? Who here has a podcast or associated with a podcast where you have guests? Right? Okay. You have a built-in marketing plan in your podcast, right? And every time you do your podcast, you should exit the audio interview and say, hey, I'm going to publish on this day. I'm going to do this post on social media. I'm going to tag you in it, and I would love if you shared it, right? Or I'm going to make a collaborative post, right? Then every single time you publish an episode, you have a sphere of influence to get more audience, right? So if you have an interview show or you interview guests, you have a built-in marketing plan that goes on a content calendar, right? That's why we make these pieces of content. Cool? Am I getting too in the weeds? Are we feeling good? Perfect. Okay. Every social media platform has a different intended interaction, okay? This is probably intuitive for digital natives. It might be something new for some people, but I'll kind of walk through what they do and how do you know whether or not you want to use them and how you want to use them. This changes, so I'll just give you my up-to-date thought on all of these, right? We used to say an Instagram was optional for your podcast. It's probably the most used social media piece for all podcasts. You could probably get away without having a website as long as you had an Instagram at this point, right? As long as you plan to do a website at some point in time. Instagram, originally designed for visual showing the life that you would wish that you had, lifestyle, things like that, is still probably the basic premise of Instagram, is showcasing lifestyle, showcasing what you do. And that's how I would think about Instagram, is lifestyle, right? We used to say in podcast marketing, make an episode card or an audiogram. Who's ever made an audiogram before, right? Yeah, okay. Audiograms are great. They cut out a little bit of your episode. There's a bunch of different software that will make them. They're less and less effective as time goes on. And the reason why is I can't really share an audiogram, right? Because an audiogram is just promoting a podcast. It's just saying go check out that podcast. If I'm a loyal audience member, that's great. If I love your podcast and I need to tell other people about it, that's great. But if every episode, all I get is an audiogram, I can't tell people about your podcast 12 times a year. That doesn't give me something, right? However, if you do something where you cut out a piece of content that's just here's this tip. Here's 5 things that you should know about Thanksgiving, how to talk to your relatives at dinner. And if you liked what I just said, check out my podcast, right? I can do something with that. I can share that. You've given me, that's how the design of all marketing content should be, is how is somebody going to share it, right? Why are they going to share it? Not just promoting the idea of I have this thing. That's a billboard, right? But taking something from your podcast and making it useful is like the next level, the tier up from how to make really desirable content. And so if you can do that interaction, it's really saleable and sellable on Instagram. Twitter, you are there to have conversation. That is what Twitter is designed for. So if you have a lot of thoughts and you have a lot of quick thoughts and you're really good at responding to other people and talking to them, Twitter is your thing. Might be Blue Sky, might be Threads. It's good to like invest wherever you want to do that. X is where you want to be, okay? Facebook. People would argue, don't put Facebook on here. It is not good. It's not great. I'm 40. So I use Facebook a lot because I'm old, but I also use Facebook a lot because I'm actually excited by it. I think that the way that they design groups is a better version of Reddit if you are using Reddit. And so it's actually tailored to like what you do and for people that don't understand how to use forums or desire forums of talking. So getting into Facebook groups is a really key way of like growth because those are direct influences of like people that might actually be wanting to talk about your subject matter. You can't enter a Facebook group unless you're authentically part of the group. So you have to be part of it to post it. I also think where Facebook is great and almost not beat is event promotion. So if you're doing event promotion, it's really good integration there and a really good way for sharing that. Otherwise, just having a Facebook is going to be like a website and it's not necessarily great for other functions outside of those things. TikTok is now on there. I would say just solidly on there. I could probably remove that asterisk in that like TikTok is very usable for podcasts and it is all about, and this is the same with YouTube Shorts and really YouTube in general, the algorithm. And the idea of the algorithm is that you are creating something that is going to show up in somebody's feed as they are mindlessly scrolling onto something else. And you're giving them something that they might want or they might like or something like that. But if you just promote something for TikTok, not gonna work. I have made TikToks that are just promoting something, it doesn't work. It's not what people want. People want to be entertained and sucked in. They want to forget about their life. They want to disassociate. They want to like understand stuff. It has to be content that stands alone. So that's really what TikTok is just about giving you content that will suck you away from whatever is important and you really should be spending your time doing instead. Okay, there are 3 tiers of being on social. The first tier is just, I'm just here. Friends and family, check me out. Give me a like. I started a podcast. Totally fine. That's great. Do that. Just be there, right? That's okay. Own it, but no, that might be where you are. The second tier is, I'm driving engagement. I'm trying to get somebody to share or to talk about a post that I have, right? That is the next level of I'm just here, that somebody can just like what I'm doing, but I'm trying to be in the conversation. And the third level is the thing I keep on going back to, is that you are creating a desirable community and a destination. Your Instagram gives me some type of identity and feeling and community that I can now associate with myself, come back to, and I look forward to seeing more posts of you telling me more about that thing. That is how you drive audience. And that's the level 3 of like social media, just thinking about how you would do your strategy or marketing. Tracking? Cool? Okay. We get a question. I'm going to pause here for a second. No, okay. We'll come here. We'll go to video. Okay. Who here wants to know more about video and podcasts? Just so I get a sense of like the room. We have roughly a fourth of people. So I'm not going to go too crazy on this because sometimes we have like everybody in the room. This is probably a thing where it is largely my specialty because that's where I started doing my marketing before, right? So people will often say, when I make a podcast, do I need to make a video, right? Do I need to make a video associated? And why would I make a video associated with it, okay? So the thing to think about is that if you are roughly younger than 34 and you are surveyed and you are asked, do you listen to podcasts? You will say yes, but most people that are telling you yes are largely telling you it is a podcast from YouTube that they usually watch, but they sometimes do not watch, right? The majority of younger listenership on podcasting is visual. That is why YouTube claims, and rightfully so, to have the most amount of podcast watching or listening, more than any other app. And they do beat out Spotify, right? So this is just something to think about, is that the younger and younger audience are associating podcasts, the term podcast, with a visual reference. I know this because TikTok ads will sometimes just stick a microphone in somebody's face and have them talk about some type of dietary supplement to imitate a podcast, because they know that TikTok or YouTube or whatever, like, younger people just want it to think of it as a podcast, right? Okay, so that's something to think about. If your goal is younger audience, you really do want to consider video and where they might be on video. And that might be hard, because you went in to do audio, you didn't want to do video, and now you have to think about, like, what it is, how am I going to do that? How am I going to expand in that? And there's 3 ways of entry, or 4 ways actually. YouTube has automatic integration into their RSS feed. And this means that you can go into YouTube. If you have a registered account, you click on advanced settings, you can, every time you publish your podcast, have it automatically publish into YouTube, and it will look like this. It will grab the episode artwork, it will grab the title, and it will be there. This puts it into YouTube Music so people can listen to it. You won't get a lot of audience, but you will be in YouTube, and you'll be around. This is a way to think about technically video, okay? This is the bare entry of, like, what it is to do video.
What did you do in advanced settings?
If you just Google the phrase integrate RSS feed with, RSS feed, with YouTube, there will be a bunch of tutorials that will show you what to do. This used to be what we told people to do. We used to say, make something cool and visual, and then they might like watch it while they have like video going, or while they have like podcasts going on. This is less and less done because you have automatic YouTube integration. You don't really need to do this anymore. You might get some more views if you make it like this or you make it entertaining, but you're not going to get enough that it's going to really worry or be worth the effort. I would just integrate it through RSS feed. This is also video. You take your whole podcast, you film it, and you put it onto YouTube. You now can integrate Spotify in the same way and just put the video there as well. This might be useful. This also might be hard. This is usually the last thing that I do when I engage in video because it's the hardest thing to get 2 people in a room or to take that audio and things like that. But if you have a natural setup and you're already doing it, you have a leg up, you might as well do it. You are then there in that visual space. The Kelsey brothers have the exact strategy for making video that everybody would want to implement, or there's nothing better than what they do. I know for a fact they do not have a podcast strategy. Their podcast is called New Heights. They have no podcast strategy. They have a video YouTube strategy, and they happen to make a podcast, okay? And they consistently, when they're in season, have one of the top podcasts in the world, top 10, top 5, things like that. The reason is that every single podcast they do, they film in different remote locations. They have a strategy to clip it up into shorts, into vertical clips, into all kinds of clips every time, and they're all over YouTube in different ways. They're getting served to you both in vertical, both in short form and long form.
So if I'm watching, I think, YouTube, and I see what's called shorts, is that what you're talking about?
That's one strategy, so that's a really good question, okay? So there's 3 places on YouTube you can make video, okay? There are shorts, which are vertical, meaning that they look like a cell phone, right? They're up and down, okay? That's one place, is a short, and those have to be less than 90 seconds, okay? There are clipping. Clipping is less than 15 minutes, I think. Horizontal, so it's like I just take a clip out of my episode and I put it there. That's a section of YouTube. And then there is full episode. So just think of the 3 areas you can do. I likely would never have a strategy that's doing all 3 unless I have a whole team. I would pick one of those. So shorts might be what I would do. I might do just full episode, or I might just do clipping out of those things. We talk with YouTube quite often. We've had a lot of conversations with them. They have confirmed to us, audiences don't skip and go to them like you would think they would do. One would think you would go from shorts, the 90-second clip, to a clip to 2 minutes, and eventually I'd get to your full episode. No. People that watch full episodes. They're there for long content. People that are there for clips, stay for clips, and people that are there for shorts. It is 3 unique audiences, right, for discovery, and that's like, those are all discovery for YouTube. Now here's the thing. This gets into like the really hairy question. Why would I do video if my only goal is to get them to listen to audio? Well, first of all, discovery is the thing, okay? So for instance, if I have a TikTok video, right, and let's say it gets 2,000 likes, okay? 2,000 likes can be converted to 2,000 conversions, right? If I had 2,000 people click on an ad, that might cost me somewhere between $3,000 and $10,000, okay? Instead, you made a free piece of content and 2,000 people interacted with it. You put it into an algorithm because algorithms are looking, they survive on you, on your content. They're looking for the bait to get fish all day long, right? An algorithm needs your content. So you are putting it into a river, a place to actually get discovery. So that is like how you're hoping for discovery. If you get good at this, anything I say would be not as good as Mr. Beast talks about how to make a successful video. Like, he'll just tell you what to do and how to make it, like what a thumbnail should do, how to look at somebody else's, and how to make it discoverable. I don't need to tell you how to make a successful YouTube video. There's other videos that'll do that. But if that's something you're interested in and you want to discover, hone that. Like, make that. Like, think of it like a model car. Like, get better at doing it. Look at your views. Think about why they clicked on it versus why they didn't click on it. And think about, like, what your thumbnail looks like, okay? The other thing is that, and this is what the Kelsey brothers know, YouTube is monetizable. You can make money on it alone. You can monetize it. And so if you actually dip into, like, I just make YouTube video, or I just make that, that can be sustainable on its own. You can instantly monetize that, maybe quicker than you do podcasts, right? But you still keep both in conversation with each other. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So short form is not good at turning people into long form listeners?
It is unlikely that you're going to have a user trajectory of like, I liked that short clip of content and I'll eventually go into like the longer form of video. That's not to say, that's a different, and I don't know if you're asking this question, but discovery of your podcast normally takes about 3 exposures. So I need to like see it 3 different times to be like, okay, I've committed that name, I might go look for it. And that might be a different way of saying long form conversion, but I just think of that as like, they're interacting in the environment that you have provided for them. I know this thing is a podcast, maybe I'll go follow it, maybe I'll go listen to it. That's what discovery looks like for that journey. Great question.
And how long was the full episodes?
Full episodes can be, I think, as long as you want.
Oh, okay.
I think Joe Rogan has like 3 hours or something like that. Yeah. Yeah. You can kind of do whatever you want there.
Okay.
And they're always expanding it. I don't know how they have all that server space.
I
I know, right? Okay. And this is another form of video. Just making, and this is the thing that I really sell the most, this idea of like, you just make something that is useful for your audience to share. This was a French podcast that we worked on about the idea, which is mostly pertaining to French culture, about women not having to have kids to make themselves relevant. Okay, so this was a very niche podcast, right? And so this was a piece of content from when Rihanna played the Super Bowl, and if you remember, she was pregnant. So this producer cut a piece of that, wrote some a post about it, and is like sharing about, in general, like let's just call it motherhood in France, or in Paris specifically. And this had nothing to do with the episode they did, right? They are the expert of motherhood in Paris. They understood the assignment of the influence, and they shared this out, and they will continue to do that, and that is a really good strategy for them because they're getting people to come to their social media platform and understand what it is they do, and eventually try out their podcast. Cool? Mm-hmm. All right. This gets into the idea of now I understand that I should have a campaign. I understand that I should have a strategy, but what should I make? How would I decide what I make? I'll just give you some lexicon on this idea. This is the starting of what is your brand and what is your identity, okay? And there's a really easy way to understand brand versus identity through this little exercise right here. What would you say this person is? If you were trying to give me like a term, who is he? Yes, he's a tourist, right? Great. Would you postulate that he's maybe a dad who is on vacation? Yes? Yeah, we'll at least run with that, okay? So let's call his brand either tourist or his brand vacation dad. His identity, that we know that, right, are maybe he has a braided belt, the weird way that he was using his cell phone, maybe he puts it over here, he's likely wearing New Balances, and he has like a plaid shirt, or he has lots of sunscreen on, things like that, okay? So his brand, his brand, vacation dad, his identity, all of these things that gave us that information, okay? So you needed to decide what is your brand, what is the thing that you want to be known for, and how are people going to know it? That's the identity, the way that you actually communicate that, right? So here's a podcast called Ologies, great podcast if you haven't listened to it before. Here's the description. A science-adjacent podcast, hosted by Ali Ward and featuring moderate amounts of swearing, okay? So they are a science podcast, but they're not going to do science the same way you think of science, right? They're going to be irreverent. They're going to be funny. Every podcast is about an ology. That's the idea of this. So it could be whatever ology you study. Pretty successful podcast, okay? So they know their brand. Their brand is like not your average science, right? Their identity is maybe they draw it out. Like they have like cute drawings. They have like this way of the font, the coloring that they have, the photos and how they post themselves. That all fits into their brand, but this is the identity of how they communicate it, right? So this is a cytorology thing that they did, right? That's a way to think about when you get in that rut of like, what should I post? You just go back to the what is my brand and how do I communicate it being what is my identity? What do I tell people about, okay? Let me pause on something because I think this is like a really important part for time in history is, do people understand this phenomenon of like targeting the manosphere for election results? Did anybody hear this happen during the election? Okay, so a strategy of like some of politics was to go on podcasts that might be targeting men to talk about politics to get like somebody interested in this idea, okay? The reason that is so successful is podcasts that target men, let's take like Joe Rogan or things like that, right? They understand their brand and they understand their identity. Men are, as the older they get, and there's statistics to prove this, getting lonelier, right? They don't have the same amount of community, and there's certain things that they're missing, right? So they understand that men who need an identity is their brand, okay? The identity is they give them health hacks. They give them, they talk about UFC, or they talk about like things that they might like associate with empowering them, right? Those podcasts understood their assignment very well about brand and identity, so it was a really good strategy to get people, if you wanted to affect that population, to get your association with that, right? So like, if you are creating a new podcast, that might be where you want to start. What is the brand that I feel like is missing? What do people not have that I could provide them? And then what would the content that actually feels like meeting that need look like? And how would I create that? That's that internal marketing idea. I worked early on one of NPR's rebranding, and I just want to show that like branding goes down to every fiber of what you do, down to the color and all of that kind of stuff. So this is things that they would say. NPR is human, honest, stories, all of these kinds of things. And when they created their color palette, they actually like titled these colors the same thing so that they would understand this is what we're trying to convey. I think at this point they actually changed the hex code of black here. It was like the big rebrand, but they call it unbiased black. There's true blue, there's rigorous red, right? They want every idea that you have associated with them to have a meaning, to be the identity of the brand. And that's, if you're into branding or into marketing, you should get down to that level to really hone in what it is you want to say. I'm closing out with some like bigger statements of ideas, but I think that it's important to remember that marketing is intuitive. You are doing it every day. And just because I talked about a lot of things that you may not do or you may not know or they feel like they're like technical things, you can market in ways that are really important to your community and your user, and you likely already know how to do it. You're just talking about it in a different way. And it's the process of thinking about communication with an objective, right? I'm not just talking to you because I want to talk to you, but I'm actually talking to you because I want to drive engagement, I want to drive discoverability, I eventually want to sell my podcast, things like that. Launching a podcast with a purpose. So these are questions that I would ask myself if I have a podcast in general. What is my win scenario, and how will I know if I've achieved it? So if I have a podcast, what am I trying to do? Is it downloads? Is it sales? How will I know when I achieved it? Because this helps you know when you might want to think about stopping and creating something else. Or it helps you know, do I really need to invest? I need to do one final investment on this thing. But knowing your win scenario is really important. Why you're doing it. Oh, if you're just doing a podcast because you just want to make friends and you just want to talk to people, make that podcast. Don't worry about all this bullshit. Just make the podcast and have fun. Don't worry about this, right? So that is its own thing. But if the idea is audience growth, then this is the question you want to ask. Okay? When you think about your win scenario, you could think about it like this. I named some of these things: goals, growth, engagement, influence, right? How am I affecting these things? 2, if I'm always prototyping, what am I testing and improving? Okay, so that's the basics idea of marketing, is that I'm testing something, but what am I testing? And every episode, you can actually test something. You could change out the intro. You could make it shorter. You could put a guest in there. You could put a news hit in the beginning. You can change out what you're doing for social media. And every time you do that, you can test something. Have you all heard of the term A/B testing? Right? Yeah. This is A/B testing? Yeah. Well, yeah, A/B testing is just this idea of that you have 2 different variables that you do the same thing on, or you do variations of the same thing on, and you see which one perform better. So you could do this with a Facebook ad if you wanted to, and just write the title different, or put the artwork different. That is giving you back information to know more about what your audience does and what they want. And so every time you publish or you create a marketing piece is a chance to prototype, but you're only doing good prototyping if you know what you're testing and what results you want to see. Make sense? Okay, cool. This is really important. Be kind to yourself. If you're a small team or if you're just a team of 1, pick your focus area of growth. Do not do them all. And don't do things you're not excited about because you won't like it. So that's that. And then I think I have one more after this. Is my ideal audience being served the way they want to? Okay, so this is a really interesting idea. You created a podcast, or you're going to create a podcast because you think you're meeting an audience need. I assume that, right? That everybody's doing that. You may not meet it, or you may not get the results you want. That's the time to go back and ask them questions. You can survey your audience, you can survey people that you wish were listening to it. Ask them questions and do it often. What podcast would you wish you had? What could be improved about my podcast? That's an okay one, right? But if you could have this podcast meet your needs, what would you do differently? Getting that feedback will eventually put you in the realm of making the best podcast that you can make. Okay? So don't sleep on surveying and asking your audience what to do. This is the next question. Where are the opportunities for my podcast to be more than a podcast? This is how you know your podcast is successful, is when your podcast becomes not just a piece of audio. So when your podcast has a successful social media, when it has a merch line that people want to purchase, when it has an event that somebody wants to go to, when it has something that is bigger than it just being a piece of audio, you have done the thing that podcasts are meant to do, and that is create an environment of your content, right? Create a way to experience what it is that you do and understand. So searching for that moment of when my podcast is not a podcast is a really good way to chase success. Does that close me out? I think it does. That is my last slide of my giant marketing lecture. Did I get done early? Does anybody have questions? Oh, I made it with 1 minute.
Yeah, we keep a few minutes for a few questions, and maybe 3 or 4 questions if you have anything for Mike.
I know you talked about A/B testing. Would you recommend just changing one thing at a time? If you're in science class, they teach you, don't have a bunch of variables, because how do you know what worked and what you can stop doing and what you should continue doing?
Yeah, I mean, you answered the question, I think, is that you need to know that one thing you're testing. So if you put 3 different changes in, what I would call is you're just launching a variation of a show then. Right? If you change 3 ideas of your show, you're not really doing A/B testing. You're just prototyping do they like the show like this? Which that's okay. That's actually great. testing new versions of show is cool. If you want to be more scientific about it, and you're like, I'd actually just love the completion rate of my podcast to be better, then you might want to dive in and be like, maybe I just shrink it a little bit. Or maybe I move like this section around and then I go back and see what it is, like that kind of stuff. So great question, I love that, yeah.
What do you think is the ideal and most effective length of a podcast?
I love this question. Okay, so so when podcasts were first like being created, let's say they're like 21 years old now, but let's say around like 5 years was when industry people started like telling you really cool things to do about podcasts. They would tell you the perfect length of a podcast is 28 minutes. Does anybody know why they would say that?
Typical commutes.
Yes, it was the average time of anybody doing a commute, okay? That's irrelevant now, especially after COVID, right? We know that we used to think podcast listening was happening majority in the car. Turns out that it's mostly third space, which is a really intimate thing. You do that when you walk your dog, when you wash your dishes, when you mow your lawn, when you go on a run. You take it with you places. So the length of the podcast needs to be directly correlated with the user and what they want. So for instance, Joe Rogan knows that if people want his podcast in place of an audiobook, and they'll just keep on listening. So he does 3 hours, and that is the perfect amount for his podcast, right? If your podcast is like The Daily or the news or giving them some like really chalky facts and things like that, you might want to keep it short, right? Because that like the more you go on, the more you might be boring them, right? Leaving somebody desiring more is always a good idea. So starting shorter is, if you don't know where to pick out, because I'm giving you like a not answer, shorter is probably better, and giving yourself like that rule of whatever. I am amazed with how many podcasts that don't have a broadcast component. Because if you have a broadcast component, this is different. You have to hit the time post, and that's what you're making it for. But if you don't have a broadcast component, why are you arbitrarily trying to make it 30 minutes every time or 60 minutes every time? Because your audience does not care. Right? They don't care if it's 62 minutes or if it's like 75 minutes or whatever, and if they do, you can test it, right? Oftentimes, when you have a podcast that is an hour long, I ask the question of like, is it really 2 podcasts? Could you be publishing twice a week? Because that might be better. You might want to give them 2 publishing things a week rather than make this giant like 1 hour podcast. And you can ask your audience that.
So 30 minutes would be your definition of short.
I would say like, I like 20-ish, 20. Going for 20. Like if you're going to start a podcast, go for 20. But like shorter, yes. Sorry. So like when I like podcast like lexicon of like what am I listening to? An hour is like normally what you think I'm saying to you. If I'm giving you a podcast, you're thinking an hour, okay? Or most people are. That would be like the average of what people are thinking. So if you go less than that, you're thinking a little bit. But there are great, phenomenal, amazing podcasts that are at 30 minutes, that are 45 minutes. There's no standardization of it. And there are great podcasts that serve you every week that do 20 minutes. So like I would throw it out the window and just figure out, because you can go on Spotify, you can go into your data and you can look at, and you can technically do this on Apple too, but the data's better on Spotify, and you can look at your completion rate, meaning when do they stop listening, right? And if they stop listening about 2 minutes beforehand, so that's like when you're doing your credits, and that number is above 80, make it longer. But if it's at 60, you might be going too long. Like if it's at 40 or 50, like if only 40% of people make it to the end of your podcast, do you have 2 podcasts? Do you have a shorter podcast? Like you let the data inform your answer.
I like the idea of 2 podcasts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, why do shows like Joe Rogan not divide up? What are people doing for 3 hours? Is there
That's a really good question. So there's a couple of things that he's doing. So one, YouTube, like 7 years ago, 5 years ago, they were rewarding long form content. They no longer do that anymore. And he got born out of that age. So he's kind of just stuck with it. So now people just know it, right? But the longer you can run a podcast, if you're that successful, the more ad breaks he can get, the more inventory he has to like sell within it. And he's not cutting it up, right? He's just going direct there. So it's actually an easy process for him to do. He has tried, and you can look at it. There was like a Joe Rogan AI, a Joe Rogan tech. Like he tried to divide up these things, and at the end of the day, that big pot, like thing that he does is really what people wanted. So it's just kind of like an over period of time, yeah.
If I were to do a video podcast and a strictly audio podcast, how would the editing be different because if I get my audio from the video and it's edited a bit differently compared to the video where it's more organic, like how would that kind of...
Again, like you said the answer in your statement. I think that's beautiful, what you would do. So it's like, typically people just take the video straight to YouTube and they don't really worry about the edit. The audio is where you get the luxury of cutting out the ums and making it a little tighter, and they don't have to match each other. So yeah. Because, I mean, think about it, like if I watch your video on YouTube, I'm likely not gonna go listen to the audio, right? So you don't have two audiences being, oh wait, these are different, right? Yeah, so I think that's the luxury you get, and you don't have to do it, right? Again, that comic book podcast I worked on, for 3 years, they would edit it meticulously to be under 40 minutes, arbitrarily. They stopped editing, and now just goes whenever. They've increased audience. So that's like an A/B testing thing that just works, you know? It's a great question.
One last question, and we'll break for.
Yeah.
Do you have a podcast you would recommend that we look at for their kind of overarching marketing strategy that would be a good example for us?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll pull from stuff that like I work on that I think are some interesting like things to look at. The Recipe, which is on Radiotopia, and it has 2 home chefs, Kenji and Deb. If you go to Kenji and Deb, The Recipe, Instagram or TikTok, they're producing 5 vertical videos an episode. It publishes every 2 weeks, and it is a great example, I think, of what making usable content from an episode really looks like that doesn't just promote the episode. I think that, does WSF carry Reveal?
Could you please spell that?
Yeah.
It's the recipe.
The Recipe. I don't know how to spell it, but the word recipe.
Look for the names.
Oh, Kenji, Kenji. That'll get you there. The other, his co-host is Deb. Reveal is a great podcast that WSF carries, an investigative podcast. Their podcast in general has done a couple of different things that are really fun and interesting. In June, they launched a series called 40 Acres and a Lie over Juneteenth. So they took the opportunity to do something different and re-release something, and it almost doubled their listenership by like introducing somebody new to the podcast. And just in October, they added a second feed to what they do, where they just talk about the news instead of doing investigative. And again, they doubled their impressions or doubled their downloads. So just 2 examples of reinventing what people do. I think they're a really good example of that. I don't know. I could go on, but those are like 2, like, I think people doing it really well. I liked Ologies, the one that I shared. I think that's like worth looking at for branding. I think that the Kelsey brothers for YouTube, like I have not found a better strategy than what they do and how they clip it out.